Hello, everyone. Today we are going to peel back the curtain on a mystery that has survived for centuries. The secret answer to how African queens protected their kingdoms. Imagine for a moment that you are standing at the edge of a desert fortress at dawn. The horizon glowing red like hot iron, and the sound of drums rolling from behind thick stone walls. The air smells of dust and frankincense, and you feel that some powerful presence has been watching you long before you arrived. These queens were not figures of myth. They were flesh and blood, women who held entire nations together with strategy so strange and so effective that historians still debate whether what they pulled off was brilliance, magic, or both. You probably wouldn't survive a day in their world, where a smile at court could hide a dagger and a marriage feast could be a battlefield where no swords were drawn. So, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And while you're at it, post your location and the local time, because history feels different depending on where you stand. Now, let's embark on today's secret history journey together. You shuffle into the fortress of Nubia, where the Kandake queen's warrior rulers, whose names echo faintly through the ruins, stood defiant against Roman legions. Picture bronze spears glinting on the walls, elephants tethered in shadows, and women in long white linen robes, anointed with gold dust, who whispered strategy by firelight. Roman generals recorded almost grudgingly that these queens fought with the ferocity of men and the cunning of foxes, and yet their greatest weapon was not the blade, but the unseen network of tunnels carved beneath the desert floor. By day, the fortresses seemed vulnerable, but by night, the Kandakes vanished underground, emerging behind enemy lines, striking fast, leaving soldiers terrified of ghosts. Odd details emerge in records, carved charms shaped like scorpions, buried in the sand at gateways, as though the queens believed spirits guarded their land. Historians still debate whether these charms were religious talismans, coded signals, or simply tools of psychological warfare. The riddle of their protection deepens when you look closer. Imagine standing in the grand hall of Meru, light flickering from torches, every column carved with lions and crocodiles, symbols meant to warn any foreign emissary that life and death here were decided by queens. Instead of hiding in the background, as in many other regions, these women placed their thrones high and visible, painted with ochre and gold eyes, staring down at visiting kings who suddenly felt small. What you sense is deliberate theater, intimidation through spectacle. A tactic as modern as any stage-managed political summit. But there was more than spectacle. There were spies. Nubian pottery fragments reveal scratched marks that archaeologists think were coded messages, passed between households disguised as trade notes. Ordinary merchants carried secrets in baskets of grain, ensuring that every move of an enemy was reported back before a single spear was raised. The most unsettling part is how these queens turned weakness into power. When Rome tried to press tribute, one Kandake queen, aim in arenas, sent back not only defiance but also the severed head of a statue of Augustus himself, buried under the temple stairs so every worshiper would step on it. Imagine the audacity. A woman leading her people to stomp on the face of the emperor of the world. That act alone frightened enemies more than 10 armies waiting at the border. You can almost hear the whisper around the fires. Our queen has made the emperor bow. It wasn't just about armies or fortresses. It was about rewriting fear. If you walk deeper into this story, you realize how much of the protection of these kingdoms came from blending the sacred and the strategic. A coronation wasn't just politics. It was a ceremony designed to make every soldier believe their queen held divine fire. At sunrise, incense smoke wound through temples, while drums beat until the air itself vibrated, convincing even skeptics that the ruler carried the favor of gods. The queens blurred lines between statecraft and spirituality so thoroughly that no enemy could separate one from the other. To attack them meant to risk fighting against heaven itself. And this is where your imagination stalls. Were they strategists who knew how to manipulate belief, or were they believers themselves wielding powers we still don't understand? That is the secret historian's chase, and it is why their kingdoms endured against impossible odds. You step away from the desert fortresses and into the humid forests, where the rain never stops, where thunder rolls as though the sky itself is a war drum, and you begin to see another side of the secret answer to how African queens protected their kingdoms. Here in the lands of Central Africa, queens hid their power not behind walls, but behind masks, rituals, and storms that seemed to answer their command. Picture yourself standing in a crowded square as villagers gather around a figure draped in raffia and painted with streaks of red clay. The air heavy with the smell of wet earth and wood smoke. The queen does not speak as herself. She appears disguised as the rainmaker, the one who calls down clouds or withholds them. Every rival knows that to challenge her is to risk famine, because if she orders the sky to close, the crops fail. Historians still debate whether these rituals were genuine belief, elaborate theater, or a carefully engineered political trick. You shuffle closer and notice the oddest detail. Goat skulls strung on ropes above the queen's dais, each with tiny carvings etched on the bone. At first they look like charms, but researchers now wonder if those carvings were codes, passed down like secret archives hidden in plain sight. The villagers believed the skulls channeled spirits, while spies and loyal advisors could read them as warnings and instructions. It is a double world where every ceremony is both magic and politics. You feel your skin prickle because you realize the queen has built a fortress not of stone, but of belief. At night, the disguise deepens. Imagine the queen stepping into a circle of firelight, painted with black ash across her eyes, her voice distorted through a hollow gourd so that it echoes like thunder. She declares rain will fall tomorrow, and when the storm breaks as predicted, her enemies shrink back, convinced she holds the sky in her hands. Was it coincidence, careful observation of weather, or a form of ancient meteorology wrapped in ritual? No one can say for sure, but the result is the same. Power secured. The secret answer to how African queens protected their kingdoms here was simple but devastating: control, the people's faith in survival itself. And no blade can touch you. Travelers from outside rooted these queens with both awe and fear. One Portuguese chronicler described being drenched in a sudden downpour after mocking a queen's ritual, and swore that she had punished him with the storm. The detail may sound absurd, but it reveals how outsiders fell into the same web of belief as locals. The queen's protection stretched beyond borders. Foreign merchants left her land whispering stories that kept enemies away. Oddly enough, one record mentions the queen wearing a mask lined with beeswax, so it glowed under torchlight, her face melting like molten gold. Imagine being in that crowd, watching her transform into something not quite human, and ask yourself if you would dare plot against her. Beneath the spectacle, however, was sharp calculation. These queens built networks of informants disguised as healers and herbalists. Women who roamed villages under the guise of checking charms but actually carried intelligence back to court. You can almost hear the coded phrases. The well water is bitter meant a rival was stirring rebellion. The Rainmaker Queen would then call a ceremony, thunder drums would sound, and the rebellion would collapse before it even began. This was not luck. It was surveillance cloaked in ritual. You keep walking, through dripping forests and firelit courtyards, and realize the genius of these women lay in turning vulnerability into untouchable authority. Where others saw only superstition, they saw the perfect cover for governance. And when challengers tried to expose the tricks, they discovered that exposing belief was harder than breaking a fortress wall. By the time skeptics finished laughing, the crowd had already decided that the queen was untouchable. That was the secret answer to how African queens protected their kingdoms here. Hide the blade behind the mask, and let fear and faith do the fighting. You move now into the candlelit halls of a palace deep in the African forests, where the scent of roasted meat mixes with honey and wine, and you finally see another layer of the secret answer to how African queens protected their kingdoms. The weapon here was not the spear or the fortress wall, but the dinner table itself. Imagine yourself seated on a carved wooden stool, a platter of sweet honey cakes laid before you, goblets filled to the brim, and laughter filling the room. Yet you sense danger in every sip, because the queen has transformed hospitality into her battlefield. Feasts became the perfect trap, where loyalty was tested, rivals lulled into comfort, and betrayal punished in silence. Historians still debate whether these legendary poisoned banquets were fact or exaggerated rumor, but whispers across centuries insist that one taste could decide the fate of an empire. You lean closer, to the glow of the oil lamps, and notice something strange. On the edge of each plate, carved into ivory, are tiny spiral patterns that at first look decorative. But archaeologists now suspect they were coded signals. A swirl with 3 turns meant the food was safe. A swirl with 4 warned, trusted allies to avoid it. To an outsider, the meal looked ordinary, but for those who understood, it was a deadly chessboard. You realized that the queen had built not only an army, but a language of survival hidden in plain sight. Picture the story of Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba, whose name still carries a weight of cunning and ferocity. She once welcomed Portuguese envoys with dazzling generosity, yet arranged the seating so that she remained elevated above them, while their emissary was forced to kneel. That was not just theater, it was domination disguised as courtesy. Some accounts even whispered that her meals contained subtle, strange flavors that made guests uneasy, assuring that only those with steady nerves could earn her trust. It might sound odd, but it shows how every element of a feast was weaponized. Even sweetness became a shield. Imagine the silence when a rival suddenly hesitated at the table. The queen's gaze would linger, the room would stiffen, and the tension alone was enough to crush dissent. You wouldn't need to draw a sword. The knowledge that she could poison honey, that she could strike in the very act of sharing bread, turned her dining halls into fortresses. This was the secret answer to how African queens protected their kingdoms, transforming daily rituals into defenses no soldier could. One tale from the Luba kingdom describes a banquet where only the queen drank from a golden cup, while her rivals drank from clay. When one clay vessel cracked mid-ceremony, spilling the wine, it was taken as a sign from the spirits that rebellion would fail. Historians still debate whether this was accident or design, yet the symbolism alone was powerful enough to silence plots. What you feel here is not just fear of death, but fear of divine judgment, carefully orchestrated by a woman who understood that belief was more binding than iron. And then there's the odd detail of bees. Chroniclers tell of queens who kept hives in palace courtyards, releasing swarms during feasts as both spectacle and warning. Imagine 1,000 bees circling the torches, wings shimmering like smoke, frozen in terror, while the queen raised her hand as if commanding them. Was it real control, or clever timing with keepers hidden in the shadows? No one can say, but the effect was unforgettable. The dinner table became an arena where nature itself seemed to obey. You step away from the feast with the unsettling awareness that food, drink, even the smallest sweetness could be turned into a fortress wall. Queens knew that an enemy might survive the battlefield, but no one could fight hunger or thirst. They bent those needs into weapons sharper than steel. That, again, is the secret answer to how African queens protected their kingdoms, by mastering the art of turning survival's most ordinary pleasures into traps too elegant to escape. You wake to the sound of wings in the night, 1,000 beating feathers cutting through the silence like whispers of ghosts. And at once you stumble into another secret answer to how African queens protected their kingdoms. It was not always swords or poison that saved them, but messages carried on the wind, codes etched where no spy could see, and networks of communication that left enemies blind. Imagine yourself in a torchlit courtyard, the queen raising her arm, and a bird lifting into the moonlight, a tiny scroll tied beneath its feathers. By dawn, that bird would cross mountains and rivers, arriving at a hidden stronghold where generals waited. To outsiders, it looked like folklore, but fragments of carved ivory and oral traditions suggest that pigeons and trained birds were indeed used to outpace marching armies. Historians still debate whether such networks were truly vast or only local, but the very idea unsettled enemies, who feared that every secret was already known before the first arrow was drawn. Step closer, and you notice ivory tusks lined with marks, scratches arranged like stars. Traders once thought they were decorative, but scholars now suspect they were coded maps, guiding loyal messengers through forests and deserts. To hold one in your hand was to hold a kingdom's invisible arteries. Imagine the odd detail. A symbol of a crocodile scratched near the base meant dangerous crossing. A spiral meant safe water. You feel a shiver as you realize how these women wove entire security systems into objects no enemy would question. Consider Queen Amina of Zatsu, a warrior ruler of the 16th century who carved her legacy not only through conquest, but through intelligence. Chroniclers say she built high earthen walls around cities, yet the greater defense lay in her spies. Women disguised as traders, singers, even wandering healers carried messages hidden in bracelets or anklets, signals that allowed her to know the size of enemy armies before they ever appeared. Was it exaggeration, or a form of coded intelligence network that rivals Europe's famed spy rings? Historians still debate, but the consistency of these tales points to something more than myth. Imagine being an enemy commander, thinking your plan's secret, only to find resistance waiting at every crossing, ambushes sprung with uncanny timing. You would swear the queens had eyes in the trees, voices in the rivers, and in a way they did. Their protection came from weaving trust into every layer of society, turning messengers into shadows who could not be silenced. That is the secret answer to how African queens protected their kingdoms, by mastering the flow of information. They built fortresses out of time itself. In one tale from the Great Lakes region, a queen sent a message carved into a hollowed gourd, sealed with beeswax, and floated it downriver. The gourd looked like ordinary debris. Downstream loyalists retrieved it and opened the wax to find instructions for a surprise raid. The odd detail here is that the gourd was marked with a streak of soot so faint it blended with the river stains. Only those who knew where to look would notice. Such ingenuity makes you wonder if ancient communication was far more advanced than we assumed. At night, fires flickered in villages while drums sent rhythms into the dark. Outsiders thought they were celebrations, but insiders heard language. A certain beat meant safe road. Another meant enemy near. You imagine yourself listening. Out. The drum echo bouncing across hills, and realizing you are hearing not music, but encrypted orders. The queen could send instructions across miles without lifting her voice. What enemy could compete with that? The most striking image remains the birds themselves, darting against the horizon, carrying secrets in silence. You feel the tension of trusting your life to a creature so fragile, yet that was the brilliance. No guard could suspect a bird. No soldier could search the wind. And so the queens commanded the unseen, their power stretching like invisible threads through forests, deserts, and rivers. That, once again, is the secret answer to how African queens protected their kingdoms, by turning nature into messenger. By making silence itself their most loyal ally, you step now into a hall heavy with incense, the walls painted in gold and indigo, and you realize another hidden chapter in the secret answer to how African queens protected their kingdoms. It was not only armies or codes that secured their thrones, but the cloak of marriage and betrayal, a theater where alliances were weapons and vows were snares. Imagine the queen seated high on a carved ebony throne, her eyes fixed on the emissary of a rival state, while musicians pluck soft notes that mask the tension. She speaks of unity, of family, of peace, and yet every syllable is a trap. The marriage she offers is not surrender, but entanglement, a rope that will pull the rival closer until escape is impossible. Historians still debate whether these marriages were made in true affection or calculated deception. But the effect remains: kingdoms preserved, borders defended, and enemies turned into pawns. Picture Queen Njinga again. That indomitable figure who used both charm and ferocity. She negotiated with Portuguese colonists, not only with soldiers at her back, but with carefully staged relationships that confused her rivals. Some accounts whisper she offered her own relatives in marriage to seal alliances, while simultaneously plotting their undoing. To modern ears it sounds ruthless, but to her it was survival. Odd details survive in letters, where Portuguese governors complained that after celebrating a union with her court, the promised support vanished, replaced by sudden raids. The cloak of marriage was not love but camouflage. You imagine yourself in one of these ceremonies, the drums thunder, dancers whirl, and two royal families clasp hands in apparent trust. Yet behind the curtain, loyal servants carry messages to generals waiting in the bush. Orders sealed with wax still warm from the queen's fingers. By the time the rival realizes the alliance was hollow, their borders are already compromised. That is the secret answer to how African queens protected their kingdoms, by weaponizing the very ritual meant to ensure peace. In Ethiopia, the legend of Queen Yodit tells of her rise not only by the sword but through calculated unions that destabilize rivals from within. Historians still debate whether her story is fact, fiction, or propaganda. But the recurring theme remains marriage was a battlefield, and queens knew how to win without blood. Imagine the odd detail of gifts exchanged. Ivory bracelets carved with snakes, symbols that two outsiders looked beautiful, but two insiders meant betrayal slithering unseen. The gesture alone was a warning cloaked in kindness. You feel the unease of standing in those chambers, watching vows spoken in honeyed tones while daggers gleam at the edges of smiles. Even when marriages were sincere, they doubled as insurance policies. A husband bound to the queen's court became a hostage of peace, unable to rebel without endangering his own kin. Enemies who thought they had gained advantage by entering the royal family discovered instead they were trapped in a web of obligation and fear. Consider also how these unions created illusions for foreign eyes. To visiting merchants, the queen appeared allied with powerful neighbors, her kingdom secure under the shadow of multiple vows. Yet within those vows were contradictions only she could manage, playing one rival against another, like pieces on a board. Was it deception, diplomacy, or genius? Historians still debate, but the brilliance is undeniable. And then there were the betrayals. The sudden reversals that left entire dynasties trembling. Imagine a rival prince who believed himself favored, only to find his wedding gift laced with a charm that marked him for exile. Or a husband who thought himself powerful, only to wake surrounded by guards loyal not to him, but to the queen. The betrayal was never loud. It was a whisper, a smile, shift in loyalty that left enemies broken before battle began. You walk away from this hall of vows with a shiver. Marriage, a symbol of unity elsewhere, was here reshaped into armor. A living shield that protected borders as surely as stone walls. That, again, is the secret answer to how African queens protected their kingdoms by turning the most sacred promises into tools of survival, weaving betrayal into silk, and making love itself bow before their throne. You hear the echo of boots on polished stone, and suddenly you are no longer in Africa's forests or deserts, but in the marbled courts of Europe, where whispers travel faster than armies. And another layer of the secret answer to how African queens protected their kingdoms reveals itself. Picture a dimly lit chamber in Lisbon or Madrid, tapestries swaying in the draught. While envoys murmur that a queen far across the seas has promised support to one king, but sent gifts to his rival. The air smells of wax and wine, yet beneath the luxury runs fear, because these women extended their influence across oceans, bending European powers into pawns for their own survival. You can almost see the startled face of a European diplomat who thought he had secured loyalty, only to discover his enemies had received the same pledge. Historians still debate whether these stories were exaggerations or deliberate myths, but the pattern persists. African queens outplayed kings in their own game of intrigue. Imagine the odd detail of a carved ivory chess piece. Found in a Portuguese archive, its crown unmistakably African. Some scholars believe it was a gift sent by a queen of Congo, symbolizing not submission, but warning that she too knew how to play the game of strategy. To hold it was to realize that every move you made was already anticipated by someone you had underestimated. You feel the weight of that realization, the sense that power had no borders, that a queen sitting thousands of miles away could shape European politics. One striking tale comes from Queen Yinga once more, who, in the 17th century, negotiated directly with papal envoys. She staged her audiences with calculated brilliance, draped in silks and seated on thrones carried by men dressed as women. A deliberate inversion meant to unsettle foreign eyes. Reports of her behavior reached Europe, where she was described as both savage and brilliant, an enigma who unsettled even seasoned ambassadors. Whether the accounts are biased or true, the outcome is clear. Her kingdom endured because she twisted perceptions into shields. You picture a candlelit hall in Rome, a map of Africa stretched across a table, cardinals debating whether to trust her promises. Somewhere across the ocean, she sat calmly, knowing their uncertainty was her greatest defense. This, too, was the secret answer to how African queens protected their kingdoms. They controlled the narrative, letting confusion itself become armor. Consider Queen Paku of the Biol people, remembered in legend for a sacrifice that secured her people's survival. Though the story carries mythic weight, some historians argue that her greatest power was not only in sacrifice, but in manipulating reputation. European traders described her as untouchable, a leader whose decisions were cloaked in mystery. That aura spread across oceans, discouraging interference. Even when no army stood at the border, her reputation alone was a fortress. The oddest details hide in correspondence. Letters between Dutch and Portuguese captains complain of being offered the same trade routes by the same queen, each convinced they were her sole partner. Imagine the shock when they discovered her duplicity. Yet what seems like deceit to them was survival to her, buying time, wealth, and peace for her people. You feel the cunning in that maneuver, the boldness of playing empires against each other. You walk through these European courts as if invisible, hearing whispers of queens who seem to pull strings from afar. Merchants mutter, priests argue, kings frown. But none can deny that their ships still docked at her ports. Their gold still flowed into her markets, because to sever ties meant risking trade entirely. That is the brilliance. She made herself indispensable, not by yielding, but by mastering the art of illusion. You leave the candlelit chambers with a chill. These queens were not isolated rulers defending forgotten corners. They were global strategists, shaping trade, religion, and politics with precision. That is the secret answer to how African queens protected their kingdoms by expanding the battlefield across oceans, using whispers as weapons and confusion as shields, until even European monarchs bowed to uncertainty. You stand now at the edge of twilight, the last torches flickering against the wind, and you realize you have arrived at the final guard of queenship, the closing chapter and the secret answer to how African queens protected their kingdoms. This is the moment when empires began to crumble, when colonial shadows stretched across the continent. And yet, even in the face of overwhelming power, these women refused to vanish quietly. Imagine the haunting image of Queen Rana Valona of Madagascar, standing on a cliffside palace, her robes snapping in the sea wind, eyes fixed on foreign ships that dared to approach her shores. To some, she was ruthless. To others, she was savior. But all agreed she kept her kingdom intact far longer than anyone expected. Historians still debate whether her isolationist policies were wisdom or cruelty. But there is no debate that they delayed colonization for decades. Step closer, and you hear stories of Queen Meremi of the Yoruba, who offered herself as a spy in enemy lands, walking barefoot into danger and weaving her way into trust before slipping home with secrets that saved her people. The odd detail of her tale is that she carried only strands of her own hair braided with beads, a token so ordinary it drew no suspicion. Yet within those beads were messages carved in miniature. Some say the beads glowed faintly in firelight, a whisper of the sacred, but whether fact or legend. They remind you that protection often came in the simplest disguises. You picture also the final stand of Queen Muhumuza of Rwanda in the early 20th century, a figure who claimed prophetic visions and rallied her people against colonial troops. To outsiders, she was a rebel. To her followers, she was untouchable, and her imprisonment only deepened her myth. Even today, historians still debate whether she was a political strategist cloaking her rebellion in prophecy, or a genuine believer in her divine mission. Either way, she embodied the last guard of queenship, the fusion of faith, defiance, and cunning that kept kingdoms alive even as the world shifted beneath them. Imagine yourself walking among her followers, hearing drums beat in defiance of rifles, the smell of gunpowder clashing with incense, the earth trembling under feet that refused to bow. You realize that this was more than resistance. It was legacy. The queens of Africa, even when cornered, knew how to turn defeat into a story that outlived the conquerors. That is perhaps the most enduring secret answer to how African queens protected their kingdoms. They ensured that their names, their myths, their lessons, became weapons stronger than iron. The oddest details linger in oral histories. In one tale, a queen carried a birdcage into exile, refusing to release the small dove inside. Some believe it was merely a comfort. Others insist it symbolized her kingdom, fragile yet alive, carried wherever she went. The dove survived longer than the empire, a quiet reminder that protection sometimes meant carrying memory forward when walls fell. You feel the chill of endings, but also the warmth of persistence. These women did not vanish. They transformed. Their kingdoms may have been carved by outsiders, but their strategies, their stories, and their courage remain etched into the fabric of history. When you listen closely, you can still hear their voices in the wind, whispering through ruins and palaces alike. So you step back from the shadows of their courts, the scent of honey, incense, and rain still clinging to you. And you understand, the secret answer to how African queens protected their kingdoms was never just one thing. It was masks and tunnels, poisoned honey and marriage vows, drums and birds, whispers and betrayals. But above all, it was the refusal to be forgotten. They turned fear into armor, faith into fortresses, and memory into weapons no empire could destroy. That is why their legacy still pulses, alive and defiant. In the stories you have now walked through, now slow down, breathe deeply, and let the sharp images soften. Imagine the torches dimming into warm embers, the drums fading into distant echoes, the voices of queens dissolving into a gentle hum that wraps you like a blanket. The air grows still, the frantic pace of secrets and battles loosens its grip, and you drift into a calmer rhythm. The dust of the desert, the rain of the forests, the smoke of feasts all blur together into a haze that no longer carries danger, but only memory. Let the names and the images float away as if on water, until you are left with nothing but the quiet truth that survival is not only power, but also peace. Close your eyes, rest in the certainty that their strength is carried through time, and allow yourself to be carried too, safe in this final whisper. End of script. Wishing you much joy and health.